one thing I've been talking to a lot of entrepreneurs about is the fortunes of so many companies just flipped, right? There were all these companies in like the online grocery space, tough space to be in, who a few months ago were really struggling. And then you had a bunch of startups in hospitality that were doing unbelievably well. Fortunes just flipped overnight. And I think that's kind of even for engineers, right? And people in market, business school, et cetera, made them recognize the fact that like into your equity, for instance, like there is real value to risk pooling, right? In a way that it didn't even feel like that. The visceral reality of that, I think, has really hit people pretty hard.
The challenge, though, is finding investors who are interested in backing people to go into this job market, where essentially what we've done with ISAs is create a very progressive way for people who are successful to help pay for those who are less successful. And,
Yep.
and there's real, that's great that there's some impact investors out there who are piloting this model. But I do think we have to ask ourselves, how sustainable will it be to have an ISA market where employment and placement is under so much pressure? And the proof is in the pudding there as to how placement numbers come out in this very challenging job market.
One other thing that I'd add is that I'm also concerned with the newfound uncertainty that needs to be priced into the ISAs, and so that might create newfound pricing pressure and drive this towards, exactly as Tess highlighted, those careers that we see to be more sure-footed, whatever the word we want to use, in terms of like having a noticeable understanding of what the band of outcomes is. And on the other hand, though, there are investors that are starved for yield right now. So if we are willing to embrace a little bit more of that uncertainty, I think a huge opportunity for the ISA community is to expand this to people who are entering some of these winner-take-all high volatility games where there is more uncertainty, but there's also huge upside. Those aren't groups of people that right now are kind of being looked at, and they should be.
This is a great way to really see the product become more viable and valuable as we see it scale more quickly. And with that scale, hopefully seeing awareness increasing and the product itself becoming more mainstream. The risk of doing that quickly, though, is we need to, first of all, ensure we have no bad actors, especially as more players enter the market as demand increases, and also ensure that we think through how to find the right capital sources when the space is still early. This is a new asset class, and so making sure that you don't always justify that the product has to be at such a high premium, given the downside protection, is not a way to make this actually the most favorable product for the student, getting back to Sam, your earlier point. So I think being thoughtful and student-centric is probably the most important thing, even in this market.
We need to just fundamentally rethink the way that people pay for their education and how they can sort of get the skills they need. And I absolutely echo Michael's sentiment that sort of both public, private, and philanthropic dollars have to come into play to sort of make it manageable for folks to be able to get, education and skills. And so I think we've also seen, just from a pattern recognition perspective, an increased demand for ISAs as the sort of unemployment crisis has hit.
From a philanthropic and government perspective, I mean, there's a lot that ISAs present that are similar to a social impact bond, from a not just return on investment, but return to community. If we think about, getting people off of government assistance programs, if you really do targeted workforce intervention, there will be recouped savings on the back end. So I think there's different ways also to think about leveraging ISAs to meet, specific community objectives or government objectives that could start playing a mix in how some of these different funders think about ISAs as a tool.
The really cool thing about them is they start to create other incentives to improve career services, to improve wraparound supports, because all of a sudden the investment capital, its incentives are to make sure that the learners get placed and everyone starts rowing in the right direction. And that suggests a lot of opportunity, I think, for not just the philanthropists backstopping these, but also social entrepreneurs getting in the space, that there's actually going to be a wind at their backs, right? So that they actually can get capital to create these entities.
The power of online education is you actually have data about how people behave and the activities that they pursue and what they appreciate and what motivates them onto the next thing that they ought to be doing. And so the irony of competency-based education is that at least in our model, is it's mentored education plus a huge array of learning experiences that can be really tailored to each individual. So it's much more akin to actually a 17th and 18th century tutored education, where you have a tutor walking a prince or princess through Europe, guiding them along their learning path, but you can do that digitally at scale.
The way we describe it internally is that kind of polish gets you a position and then skills get you the salary. So the binary whether or not a student gets hired relies largely upon how they interact in a person-to-person environment. So we train that really heavily. And I actually personally believe that it can be trained. It's difficult and it's different than what you would do perhaps in-person environment in some instances. But yeah, our career coaches get really good at helping you kind of navigate that physical world in an online setting. It's probably not 100%. I don't know what level of efficacy it is. We don't have like a giant data set to, say that it's N%. And obviously I'm incentivized to say this, but I think you can get there online.
As we begin to build momentum in this community around the right policy framework for ISAs, bringing some of those conversations together is going to be so critical in establishing ultimately the framework that supports this market.
On the state level, I think that's all the more important to be not just kind of pushing back against efforts to try to kind of make ISAs illegal, but rather to really start thinking about what is a regulatory framework that actually can protect students, what is that is also consistent with ISAs. I think in this conversation there is such an amazing kind of large overlap between I think what consumer protection advocates want in terms of outcomes and what the ISA market can withstand in order to be very successful. And so there's, I think, a big kind of overlap in that Venn diagram, but we need to actually be actually have examples of that in models ready for when that comes about to say, here's actually something that all of us can agree on.